A billionaire CEO loses her wallet. A broke, exhausted single father finds it. He could have kept the $50. God knows he needed it. Instead, he tracked her down and handed it back without asking for anything. She said thank you. He walked away. And that should have been the end of it. But she followed him. What she discovered over the next 3 weeks would expose a multi-million-dollar fraud buried inside her own company, and force her to question everything she thought she knew about success, power, and what kind of person she actually wanted to be. If you're watching this until the end, hit that like button now and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The cafe closed at 10. That was the rule, and Marcus, the overnight manager, enforced it with the enthusiasm of a man who had been doing the same job for 11 years and intended to do it for 11 more. At 9:58, the overhead lights shifted from warm amber to the flat, unforgiving fluorescent glow that told every remaining customer their welcome had officially expired. Chairs scraped, coats were gathered. The last few conversations died mid-sentence, the way conversations always did when light changed and people remembered they had somewhere else to be. Nolan Hayes was already moving between the tables before the lights finished switching. He carried a gray plastic bin on his left hip, the way he'd learned to carry it 6 weeks into this job, balanced against his body so his right hand stayed free to wipe surfaces, collect cups, stack plates. It was a small efficiency that nobody had taught him. He'd figured it out himself on a Tuesday night when his back was burning and he still had 40 minutes left on his shift, and he needed to find a way to make the work go faster without actually cutting corners, because cutting corners meant redoing things, and redoing things meant staying later. And staying later meant less sleep, and less sleep meant he'd be half dead at his second job by 7 the next morning. He'd been doing this kind of math for 3 years. The table near the window, the foretop that the office crowd always took because it had the best view of the street, had been cleared of cups and napkins, but not properly wiped down. Nolan set the bin on the adjacent chair, dampened his cloth from the spray bottle clipped to his apron, and started at the far corner of the table, working in slow circles the way the training manual suggested, but which nobody actually did because the manual had been written by someone who had never worked a closing shift in their life. He was almost done when the cloth hit something solid under the edge of the table. Small. Flat. Wedged into the narrow gap between the tabletop and the lip of the wooden trim. He pulled it out. A wallet. Women's, by the look of it. Slim. The kind made from cognac-colored leather that had been expensive once and still looked like it. No cash sticking out, no loyalty cards fanned across the outside pocket. Just a quiet, compact rectangle that someone had set down on the table at some point during the evening and either forgotten or simply failed to notice had slipped into the gap. Nolan turned it over in his hand. His first thought was entirely practical. Bring it to Marcus, log it in the lost and found binder, done. That was procedure. He'd found 3 lost items in the 6 weeks he'd worked here. A phone, a scarf, a set of keys, and all 3 had gone directly to Marcus without Nolan opening anything or touching anything he didn't need to touch. He flipped the wallet open, not to look through it, just to check for contact information. That was what he told himself. The main compartment held 3 things: a folded $50 bill, a small stack of business cards, and a driver's license in a clear plastic sleeve. Nolan slid the license out just far enough to read the name. Avery Langford. The photo showed a woman with sharp dark eyes and dark hair pulled back efficiently. The expression she wore for the camera, not exactly a smile, but not hostile either. Just composed. The look of someone who'd sat for 100 ID photos and knew the drill. Her address listed a part of the city Nolan had only ever driven through, not stopped in. He checked the business cards. They were simple, heavy cardstock. The name Avery Langford embossed in clean black type, CEO, Langford Tech Group underneath, and a direct office number at the bottom. Nolan stood there for a moment, holding the wallet in both hands, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. $50. He knew exactly what $50 meant. He knew it the way people who count money carefully always know it. Not as an abstract number, but as a specific set of choices. $50 was 3 days of groceries if he was careful. It was the difference between paying the water bill on time this month or having that particular anxiety sitting on his chest for another week. It was 2 tanks of gas. It was the field trip fee that Lily's school had sent home twice already. The yellow slip still sitting on the kitchen counter under a coffee mug because every time he looked at it, he thought next week and moved on. He put the $50 back exactly where it was. He closed the wallet and carried it to Marcus. Marcus logged it in the binder, took the wallet behind the counter, and told Nolan he could finish his tables. Nolan finished his tables. He clocked out at 10:22, 3 minutes later than usual because someone had knocked a glass of water off the counter near the register and the paper towels had been out in the back dispenser and he'd had to get a new roll from the supply closet. He changed out of his apron in the back room, pulled on his jacket, a dark green canvas barn coat that was starting to thin at the elbows, and pushed out through the rear door into the alley behind the cafe. The October air hit him like a hand flat against the face, cold enough to mean business, not yet cold enough to be cruel. He stood in the alley for a moment with his hands in his jacket pockets, breathing. This was the part of the night that was just his. The 12 minutes between the end of his cafe shift and when he had to be in his car driving toward his second job. Not enough time to do anything useful. Barely enough time to remember who he was outside of work. He'd stopped trying to use it productively. Now he just stood in whatever alley or parking lot was nearby and breathed for a while and thought about Lily. She'd be asleep at her grandmother's apartment by now. She'd been asleep for 2 hours, probably. 8-year-olds didn't stay up until 10 unless there was a birthday party or a stomach bug involved. And Carol, his late wife's mother, his family now, the person who made the whole arrangement possible, kept a strict bedtime schedule that Lily had long since stopped fighting. She was a reasonable kid. She always had been. Nolan sometimes thought that was the part that hurt the most. Not that she complained. She never complained. Not about the apartment that was too small, not about the shoes that had lasted 2 seasons longer than they should have, not about the fact that her father was almost never home before 9. She just adapted. She just moved through the circumstances of her life with a quiet flexibility that no 8-year-old should have to have. He pulled out his phone and looked at the photo she'd texted him that afternoon. She'd drawn a picture at school, a house with a big tree, 2 stick figures in the yard, a yellow sun in the upper corner the way every kid drew suns. She'd labeled the taller figure Dada in uneven capital letters and the shorter one ME and sent it to him with no message, just the photo and then a row of hearts. He'd been in the middle of a lunch rush when it came through. He'd looked at it for 4 seconds and then put the phone back in his apron pocket and kept moving. He looked at it again now, in the alley, in the cold. Then he pocketed his phone, walked to his car, a 2014 Honda Civic with a dent in the rear quarter panel and a heating system that worked intermittently, and drove to his second job. Yeah, he worked logistics dispatch 3 nights a week at a shipping depot on the eastern edge of the city, monitoring overnight deliveries and fielding calls from drivers. It was mostly sitting and watching screens and occasionally talking someone through a route problem, and the primary requirement was that you stay awake, which Nolan managed through a combination of black coffee and the specific anxiety that came from knowing that if he lost this job, he'd have to find another one before the month ended. He got home at 3:40. He set an alarm for 6:50. He slept. In the morning, before Carol arrived to take Lily to school, he called the cafe. Marcus answered on the 3rd ring with the tone of someone who'd been there since opening and was already tired of the day. "The wallet we logged last night," Nolan said. "Has anyone come in for it?" "Not yet." "Can you give me the number from the business card inside?" "I want to try calling directly." A pause. "Nolan, that's what the binder's for. The owner calls us." "I know, but there was a phone number on one of the cards. I just thought, I'm not supposed to pass on contact information from lost items." "Right." Nolan paused. "Can I at least check if there's an email on one of the cards? I could send a quick message." Another pause. Longer this time. Marcus had a pragmatic soul underneath the bureaucratic exterior. Nolan had figured that out within his first week. "Hold on." The line went quiet. Nolan could hear the morning rush starting up in the background. The hiss of the espresso machine, someone calling out a drink order, the bell above the door ringing. "Langford Tech Group," Marcus said. "Try their main website. If there's a contact email, use that." "Thanks, Marcus." He found the website in 30 seconds. Langford Tech Group. Clean, professional design, the kind of website that communicated competence without trying too hard. A brief company overview, a list of projects, a contact page. And on the About tab, a headshot of Avery Langford. The same dark eyes from the license photo, but in this one, she was standing in front of a floor-to-ceiling window with the city spread out behind her, and she looked like exactly the kind of person who owned a slim leather wallet and put her business cards in it. He used the general contact email on the website. He kept it short. Good morning. My name is Nolan Hayes. I found a wallet last night that I believe belongs to Miss Langford. It's currently in the Lost and Found at Bellamy's Cafe on Harwick Street. Everything inside appears to be intact. If you could let her know, I'd appreciate it. Thank you. He sent it and forgot about it. He didn't forget about it, actually. He thought about it on the drive to Lily's school drop-off, and he thought about it during the lunch prep shift at the cafe. And he thought about it that afternoon when he was sitting in the parking lot of the community center with 15 minutes before the tutoring session started, eating a gas station sandwich and reading over the math worksheets he'd printed the night before. Not because he expected anything, not because he imagined the CEO of Langford Tech Group was going to respond to a contact form email about a lost wallet and offer him some kind of reward. He wasn't that kind of naive. He'd been around long enough to know that the world mostly didn't work that way, that good things done quietly stayed quiet, and that the kinds of people who owned companies on the 32nd floor of glass towers moved through a different version of the city than he did. He thought about it because of the $50, not because he wanted it. He'd put it back without thinking twice. But because he kept coming back to the arithmetic of the thing, the field trip slip under the coffee mug, the heating bill he'd been stretching, the shoes Lily needed before winter really hit. And then he kept coming back to the fact that he'd put it back anyway, and he wasn't sure if that made him principled or stupid, and on his worst days those two things felt uncomfortably similar. His phone buzzed. Unknown number, city area code. Nolan Hayes, he answered, because that was how he answered calls from numbers he didn't recognize. Professionally. Like someone who was used to being contacted about logistics problems at odd hours. Mr. Hayes. A woman's voice. Precise. Not warm exactly, but not cold either. Like someone who chose their words with care. This is Avery Langford. I received your message. Nolan sat up slightly in the driver's seat. Ms. Langford. Yes. The wallet's at the cafe on Harwick. I can leave the address if you need it. I know the cafe. I was there yesterday evening. A pause. I want to thank you. Most people wouldn't have bothered. It wasn't a big deal. It was, actually. She said it without inflection, like she was correcting a factual error. But I understand why you'd say that. I'll pick it up this afternoon. Great, they'll have it at the counter. Ask for Marcus. Mr. Hayes. Her voice shifted slightly. Not warmer, exactly. Thoughtful, maybe. I appreciate what you did. If there's anything I can... You don't need to do that, Nolan said, and he said it fast enough that it came out sharper than he intended. He softened it. I mean, I appreciate it, but no, it's fine. I just wanted to make sure it got back to you. A longer pause this time. All right, she said. Thank you. Take care. He hung up. He stared at the windshield for a moment. Through it, he could see the side entrance of the community center, an old converted church hall with a patched parking lot and a hand-painted sign above the door that said Riverside Learning Center in letters that had been retouched so many times they were slightly different widths. A group of kids were already gathering near the entrance. He recognized Marcus Jr., who was 9 and terrible at fractions and passionate about everything related to dinosaurs, and Deshawn, who was 11 and had started coming 3 months ago after his mother asked if there was anything available for kids whose parents worked evenings. Nolan folded the math worksheets and got out of the car. Avery Langford picked up her wallet at 4:15 that afternoon. She knew the cafe. She passed it most mornings on her way to the office, had stopped in occasionally over the past 2 years for coffee when the line at her regular place was too long. She didn't know the man who worked closing shift. She'd been there for a late meeting with a prospective partner who had wanted to talk somewhere less corporate, and she'd stayed after the meeting ended because she had calls to return and the ambient noise helped her think, which was something she'd never told anyone because she knew exactly how it would sound. She'd set her wallet on the table. She'd gathered her things when her phone rang mid-packing. She'd walked out with the call already in her ear. The manager, Marcus, whose name tag was slightly crooked, retrieved the wallet from a binder on the back counter, confirmed her ID, and had her sign a log sheet. He was professionally neutral about the whole transaction, but when she said, "The person who found this, I spoke to him on the phone." Nolan Hayes? Marcus's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Yeah," Marcus said. "He called this morning to make sure you'd been reached." "He works evenings here?" "Closing shift, 4 nights a week." Avery opened her wallet. The 50 was there. The business cards, the license, everything exactly where it had been. "Does he know the owner?" she asked. "Or the regular customers?" Marcus looked at her with the measured expression of someone who dealt with 100 people a day and had developed good instincts about intent. "Why?" "Just curious." Marcus thought about it. "He keeps to himself, does his job, shows up when he says he will." He paused. "Good worker." Avery tucked the wallet into her bag. She said thank you and walked out. She should have gone directly to her car. She had a board call at 5 and a department review at 6:30 and approximately 45 minutes of prep work between them that she had not yet done. Her day had been running 11 minutes behind schedule since 11 o'clock, and she'd been mentally tightening the margins all afternoon. Instead, she stood on the sidewalk outside the cafe and opened her phone. Nolan Hayes, Bellamy's Cafe, closing shift. She searched the name. Nothing notable came up. A LinkedIn profile that hadn't been updated in 3 years showed a previous job in warehouse management, and before that, something in construction logistics. No social media presence to speak of. The phone number she'd called was registered to a billing address in the Westfield district, which was a neighborhood she knew by reputation more than by direct experience. Working class, aging infrastructure, the kind of place where the bodegas stayed open late and the parking lots were always full. She put her phone away. She told herself she was going to her car. Instead, she crossed the street to where she could see the cafe's rear entrance from an angle, and she waited. She wasn't entirely sure why. Something about the phone call had stayed with her. Not what he'd said. He'd said almost nothing, which was maybe the thing. He hadn't asked for anything. He hadn't let the conversation breathe long enough for her to offer anything. He'd been almost aggressively uninterested in being thanked, which was unusual in her experience. Because most people who did something generous wanted at least a moment to be recognized for it. It was human. She understood it. She would have felt the same way. He'd cut it off before it could even get there. She wanted to know why. At 5:10, the back door of the cafe opened and Nolan Hayes came out. She recognized him from Marcus's vague description. Late 20s or early 30s, medium height, wearing a green canvas jacket that had seen better days. He carried himself with a specific kind of tiredness that wasn't about posture so much as momentum. The walk of someone who was always already thinking about the next thing. The way people moved when they had too many obligations and not enough hours. He stood in the alley for a moment with his hands in his pockets. Avery watched him from across the street, half hidden behind a parked delivery truck, feeling faintly absurd about the whole situation. She was a CEO. She was 30 years old. She had a board call in 49 minutes. She was standing behind a truck watching a cafe worker breathe cold air in an alley. He pulled out his phone, looked at something on it for a long moment. His face changed. Not dramatically. He didn't smile exactly. It was more like the tension in it shifted, just briefly, to something softer. She couldn't see the screen from where she stood. Then he pocketed the phone, walked to a Civic with a dented back panel, and drove away. Avery stood on the sidewalk. She thought, I should go to my car. Instead, she followed him. She told herself she'd follow for 2 minutes and then peel off. 5 minutes turned into 10. His route took him northeast, away from downtown, through a part of the city she didn't know well, a grid of older neighborhoods with wide streets and bare-limbed trees and the kind of commercial strip that had been there long enough to have several layers, new signs over older brick. He drove carefully, but not slowly, signaling every turn, staying in his lane. She followed at a distance, feeling progressively more like she was doing something either very interesting or very foolish, and uncertain which. He turned off the main road onto a side street she didn't recognize, and then into a patchy asphalt parking lot. She pulled over at the corner. The building across the lot was a converted church hall. Wide, low, older brick with new windows that didn't quite match the original architecture. A hand-painted sign above a side door, Riverside Learning Center. Below it, smaller, in what looked like a different hand, all children welcome, no cost. Nolan got out of his car. He stood at the trunk for a moment, pulling out a canvas bag, the kind people use for groceries. He was moving differently now. Not faster exactly, but purposeful, less compressed, like a specific weight had shifted off one part of him and redistributed itself somewhere else. A kid came running across the parking lot, 9 or 10 years old, skinny, wearing a jacket a size too big, moving at the kind of full-throttle sprint that only kids and large dogs managed. He ran straight at Nolan and would have collided with him if Nolan hadn't braced, which he did, the way someone braced who'd been hit by this particular kid before and knew it was coming. "Mr. Nolan!" The kid grabbed his arm with both hands. Marcus Jr. got in trouble again in math, and Mrs. Terry sent a note home and his mom is really mad and he said you told him to come early. "Hey!" Nolan put a hand on the kid's shoulder. Not hard, just enough to slow him down. "Deshaun, breathe." Deshaun breathed. "Where's Marcus Jr. now?" "Inside. He's kind of crying, but he's trying to act like he's not." Nolan looked at the building. Something passed across his face. Not impatience, not inconvenience. Something closer to recognition. Like this was not a disruption, but a thing that was simply part of the shape of the evening. "All right," he said. "Let's go figure it out." They walked toward the building side by side, the kid talking fast, Nolan nodding at the right intervals, and they pushed through the side door and were gone. Avery sat in her car with the engine running. She missed her board call. She didn't realize it until her phone started buzzing 11 minutes later, her assistant's name on the screen, and by then she'd been sitting there so long that her windshield had fogged slightly at the edges. She declined the call. She sat there for another 20 minutes, watching the windows of the community center glow yellow in the early dark, thinking about a man who'd returned a wallet with $50 in it and then driven to a building full of kids who needed something from him and walked in like it was the most obvious thing in the world. She'd interviewed 100 people for senior positions in her company. She'd sat across from people with MBAs and referral letters and 5-year plans articulated in bullet points. She'd hired some of them. Some of them had been excellent. A few of them had turned out to be something else entirely, and she was still sorting out what to do about that. She looked at the building. She thought about the $50. She took out her notebook, actual paper, the narrow-ruled kind, one of 6 she kept in rotation, and wrote a single line at the top of a blank page. "Who is Nolan Hayes?" Not a question. She didn't write it like a question, just a thing that needed answering. So she went back the next evening. And the evening after that. She didn't go inside. She wasn't sure what she would have said if she had. "Hi, I'm the woman whose wallet you found. I've been watching you from a parking lot for 3 days" was not an introduction she was prepared to make. She told herself she was doing due diligence. She told herself she was curious. She told herself a lot of things that were partly true and mostly beside the point because the real reason she kept coming back was simpler and harder to articulate. She had not seen someone work like that in a long time. Not efficiently, not impressively, like it meant something. She'd watched him fix a desk, actually get on his knees with a screwdriver and fix a wobbling desk, while a 7-year-old girl sat on top of it to hold it steady and told him about her hamster. She'd watched him sit with a kid who was crying over homework, not consoling exactly, just present, asking questions in a low voice until the crying slowed and the kid picked up the pencil again. She'd watched him carry a box of food from his car into the building, just a cardboard box packed with grocery store items, that he set down in the kitchen without ceremony and without anyone seeming to ask for it. On the 4th evening, she took out her phone and called her head of research. "I need a background on someone," she said. "Personal, not professional. Be careful with it." The report came back in 48 hours. She read it at her desk on a Friday morning with the city visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind her screen and a cup of coffee going cold beside her keyboard. Nolan Hayes, 32. Born in this city, raised in Westfield. High school diploma, 2 years of community college, logistics certifications, had been climbing steadily through warehouse and operations management in his late 20s, solid trajectory, nothing flashy, the kind of career built on reliability rather than ambition. Married at 26, daughter born a year later, his wife, Rachel Hayes, had died from an illness when Lily was 4. Avery stopped reading for a moment. She made herself continue. In the year after Rachel's death, Nolan had taken 2 jobs simultaneously and moved from the house they'd been renting to a smaller apartment in a cheaper part of Westfield. His mother-in-law, Carol, had become the primary daytime caregiver for Lily. 7 months ago, he had been offered a senior management position at a regional logistics firm, the kind of role that would have doubled his income and put him on a real career track. The position required relocation to a branch office 2 states away. He'd turned it down. The interviewer's notes, which her researcher had obtained through channels Avery chose not to examine too closely, included a single line. Candidate declined to elaborate on reasoning, said only that relocation wasn't possible at this time. Avery sat back in her chair. She looked at the city through the window. Then she kept reading. The community center had been operating for 9 years on a combination of city grants, private donations, and 1 major corporate sponsorship that covered roughly 40% of its annual operating budget. That sponsorship, from a fund managed through the charitable giving program of a mid-sized regional bank, had been renewed consistently for 6 years. 3 months ago, it had been abruptly withdrawn, no public explanation. The center's director, a woman named Patricia Osei, 57, who had started the program herself in the back room of this same building before it outgrew her original space, had been told only that the funding priorities had shifted. She was still pursuing alternative sources. The center was operating on reserves that would last, by Avery's estimate, maybe 4 more months. She turned to the next page of the report and stopped. The charitable fund that had withdrawn the sponsorship was managed through a third-party financial services firm. The firm had 3 major institutional clients. One of those clients was Langford Tech Group. Avery read that sentence twice. Then she pulled up the company's charitable giving records on her internal system. It took her 11 minutes to find what she was looking for. Not because it was well hidden. It wasn't, not really. Not once you were looking directly at it. But because the structure of it was dense and layered in the particular way that things got dense and layered when someone with detailed knowledge of a system wanted something to disappear quietly rather than visibly. She found it. She sat very still. She picked up her phone. She did not make a call. She set it back down. She looked at the document on her screen for a long moment, and then she looked out the window at the city, and then she thought about a man on his knees with a screwdriver fixing a wobbly desk while a 7-year-old told him about her hamster. She pulled a fresh page in her notebook. She started writing. What's up? That evening, she went back to the parking lot. She wasn't sure what she was doing there exactly. The report had changed something, had made the whole thing denser, more tangled, layered with implications she hadn't fully sorted through yet. She needed to think, and she'd found over the past week that thinking happened better in this parking lot, watching the yellow windows, than it did at her desk or in the car or in her apartment where the silence was a different kind of heavy. At 7:40, the side door opened. Nolan came out alone. He sat on the front bumper of his Civic and ate something from a paper bag. The kind of eating that happened between obligations, fast and not particularly enjoyable, the fuel stop version of dinner. He was on his phone, and from the way he was talking, animated, leaning slightly forward, she could tell it wasn't work. He laughed at something. It was a real laugh. Not the polished social laugh of someone performing ease, but the slightly ungainly, unguarded kind that happened when something was actually funny and you weren't ready for it. He put his hand up to his face afterwards, still smiling. Avery realized she'd been watching him for a week, and this was the first time she'd seen him laugh. She thought, he's going to lose this place. She thought, not if I can help it. She thought, there are 3 things I need to understand before I can do anything. She opened her notebook. She started writing faster. Later, much later, long after this was over and she'd had time to look back at the whole sequence of events with the clarity that distance allows, Avery would try to identify the exact moment when everything shifted, when it stopped being curiosity and started being something else. She never could pinpoint it precisely, But when she tried, she always came back to that parking lot. The cold air, the yellow windows, the sound of a laugh she wasn't supposed to hear, and a line in a notebook that she'd underlined twice without quite knowing why. Who is Nolan Hayes? She was starting to understand the answer. She wasn't sure she was ready for what came next. The thing about watching someone for a week without them knowing was that you started to see patterns. Not the curated kind of patterns that people showed you when they knew they were being observed. The careful version of themselves. The managed presentation. The real kind. The rhythms that existed because they were just the way a person moved through the world, not because anyone was watching. Avery had built a company by reading people. She'd learned to do it the way you learned most useful things. Through failure first, and then through attention. She'd hired 3 wrong people in her first 18 months, and each mistake had cost her something: time, money, once a near catastrophic data breach that had been contained only because a junior engineer happened to notice the anomaly on a Saturday morning. After the 3rd one, she'd started paying attention differently. Not to what people said, to what they did when they thought the outcome didn't matter. Nolan Hayes, by that measure, was one of the more consistent people she'd ever observed. He arrived at the community center within the same 10-minute window every evening. Not because the center had a strict schedule for him, Patricia Osei had confirmed. When Avery finally called the center directly under the pretext of a potential donor inquiry, that Nolan was technically a volunteer and could come and go as he pleased. He just came at the same time because that was when he came. Because the kids expected him, and he didn't see the point in being unpredictable about something that mattered. He always checked the supply closet first thing. She'd noticed that on day 2, he'd go in, spend 2 or 3 minutes, come back out with either a sense of purpose or a slightly compressed expression that meant something needed restocking. On the evenings when the expression was compressed, he'd sometimes reappear from the parking lot 20 minutes later with a grocery bag. She'd been close enough once to see what was in it: paper towels, whiteboard markers, a box of granola bars. He paid for that himself. She was certain of it, though she hadn't been able to confirm it directly. The center's budget, which Patricia had shared during their call with the particular weariness of a person who'd been sharing bad financial news for months, did not have a line item for supplies purchased by Nolan. He wasn't being reimbursed. He just bought the things that were needed and put them where they belonged. It wasn't performative. That was what kept striking her. There was no audience for any of it. The kids weren't watching when he restocked the supply closet. No one was taking notes. He fixed the things that were broken and replaced the things that ran out because they needed fixing and replacing, and that was the whole of his motivation as far as she could tell. She found that genuinely difficult to categorize. She'd spent her career in a world where action and intent were almost always linked to outcome, where people did generous things because they wanted something in return, even if that something was just the feeling of having been generous. She wasn't cynical about it. That was just how humans functioned. The whole architecture of professional philanthropy was built on the understanding that giving felt good and that feeling good was a legitimate motivation. She'd signed checks for causes she cared about and felt the clean satisfaction of it afterward and never pretended otherwise. But Nolan didn't seem to be doing any of that accounting. He didn't seem to be running the numbers on how his behavior reflected on him. He just did the next necessary thing and moved on to the thing after that. She found it almost unsettling. On Thursday evening, 8 days after she'd first followed him from the cafe alley, she finally went inside. She'd told herself she wasn't going to. She'd had the conversation in her head multiple times: what she'd say, how she'd frame it, what his likely response would be. And each version of it ended in a way that felt presumptuous or awkward or both. But that evening, she'd been sitting in the parking lot for 35 minutes, and her back was starting to ache, and a woman she didn't recognize had come out of the center, noticed Avery's car parked at the edge of the lot, and stared at it long enough that Avery understood she had officially become suspicious. She got out of the car. The side door was unlocked. A hand-lettered sign taped to the inside wall said, "Welcome. All programs free. Sign in at desk." There was no desk immediately visible. There was a folding table with a sign-in binder on it and a basket of name tag stickers beside it. And beyond that, a wide-open room that smelled like dry erase markers and someone's reheated dinner. About 15 kids, ranging from maybe 7 to 12, were spread across mismatched tables. Some of them were doing homework. 2 were playing a board game in the corner. 3 were clustered around a whiteboard where someone had worked a math problem halfway through and then apparently been interrupted. Nolan was at the far end of the room, sitting backward on a folding chair, talking to a boy Avery recognized as Deshawn, the same kid who'd sprinted across the parking lot on her first evening watching. Deshawn had a worksheet in front of him and a pencil he was twirling with the specific agitation of someone who understood approximately 0% of what they were looking at. "I don't get why X has to equal anything," Deshawn was saying. "Why can't it just be X? Why does it have to be a number?" "Because if it's just X, we can't use it for anything," Nolan said. "It's like, okay, you know how when you need to call someone, you need their actual phone number? You can't just dial Deshawn's number." "That's different." "Is it?" Deshawn scowled at the worksheet. "Kind of. Work the first one. Just try it." "What if I get it wrong?" "Then you get it wrong and I tell you where you went sideways and you try again. That's the whole thing." Deshawn looked deeply unconvinced but picked up the pencil. Avery stood near the entrance, not sure what she was doing or what she'd expected. A woman came through a door at the back of the room carrying a stack of folders. 50s, broad-shouldered, wearing reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and the expression of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by anything. "Can I help you?" "I hope so," Avery said. "I'm looking for Patricia Osai. I called earlier this week, but about a donation inquiry." The woman looked at her for a moment. Not unfriendly, just measuring. "I'm Patricia. You're earlier than I expected." "I was in the neighborhood." Patricia's expression said she found this only partially credible, but she gestured toward the back. "Come on back. I can give you 10 minutes before I need to start dinner service." Avery followed her through the door, past a narrow hallway, into a small office that had been carved out of what looked like it had originally been a storage room. The desk was a salvaged wooden table stacked with folders and grant applications and printouts that had been annotated heavily in red pen. The 2 chairs across from it were mismatched, one with a cracked armrest. Patricia sat down and looked at her steadily. "You said on the phone you were with a private foundation." "I said I was inquiring on behalf of private interests," Avery said. "That's accurate, though I want to be direct with you. I'm actually here in a personal capacity. My name is Avery Langford." Patricia didn't react to the name, which either meant she didn't know it, or she did, and wasn't impressed. Avery found she genuinely couldn't tell. "And what is your personal capacity?" "I've been trying to understand what happened with your corporate sponsorship, the one that was withdrawn 3 months ago." Patricia's expression shifted, not defensively, more like a door closing quietly. "That's not information I'm able to share with. I know the funding was channeled through a third-party management firm," Avery said. "I know the fund in question had ties to Langford Tech Group. That's my company. Which means this is at least partly my problem." A long silence. Patricia took off her reading glasses and set them on the desk. She looked at Avery with an entirely different quality of attention now. Not hostile, but very direct, the look of someone deciding in real time how much to trust. "What do you want to know?" Patricia said finally. "Everything you can tell me," Patricia told her. It took 40 minutes, not 10. By the time she finished, the dinner service had started in the main room, the smell of something with tomatoes and garlic drifting through the door. And Avery had filled 2 pages of her notebook with dense, careful writing. The story was not complicated in its outline, though it was deeply complicated in its details. The corporate sponsorship had been part of Langford Tech Group's charitable giving program for 6 years, administered through a financial services firm called Meridian Partners, which managed the disbursement of charitable funds on behalf of several institutional clients. 18 months ago, the disbursements had started arriving late, then smaller than expected. Then, 3 months ago, not at all, with a letter from Meridian Partners explaining that funding priorities had been redirected. Patricia had made calls. She'd spoken to her liaison at the bank that handled their account, to 2 people at the city's nonprofit resource center, and eventually to a lawyer friend who'd reviewed the contract language and told her she had grounds to contest the withdrawal, but that contesting it would cost more than it was worth and take longer than the center had. "Someone made a decision," Patricia said, "inside your company or inside Meridian or somewhere between the 2. And either they didn't care about the consequences or they were counting on us being too small to push back." "Which were you?" Patricia looked at her steadily. We're small, but we push back anyway. She paused. We're still pushing. Avery closed her notebook. She looked around the small office, at the stacked grant applications, the annotated printouts, the hand-drawn calendar on the wall with colored markers tracking program schedules, at the small framed photo on the corner of the desk. Patricia standing in front of the building when it still had the old sign, surrounded by kids who were all various heights and expressions, one of them making a face at the camera. How long do you have? Avery asked. Realistically. Patricia didn't hesitate. 4 months. Maybe 5 if we run the dinner program at reduced capacity and cut the weekend tutoring. And Nolan Hayes, does he know how close it is? Something moved in Patricia's expression. You know Nolan? Not exactly. Avery paused. I've been watching him work for a week. I know he doesn't know I'm here. Patricia was quiet for a moment. She had the thoughtful, unhurried quality of someone who'd lived long enough to be patient with complicated things. Nolan knows the situation is bad, she said finally. He doesn't know the exact numbers. I haven't told him because... She stopped. Because? Because he'd try to fix it himself. And he can't fix it himself, and I don't want to watch him try. Avery nodded slowly. He's been doing fundraisers, Patricia continued. Little ones, bake sales, a car wash last month, a raffle. He doesn't tell me ahead of time. Just shows up with whatever he's raised and puts it toward the supply fund. I've stopped asking where the money comes from. She paused. Last week he asked me what the property taxes on this building cost annually. Avery looked at her. I told him, Patricia said. Then I told him not to do whatever he was thinking about doing. He said he wasn't thinking about anything. He was a bad liar about it. She looked at the photo on her desk. His wife grew up 2 blocks from here. Did you know that? Avery shook her head. Rachel Hayes. She volunteered here for 3 years before she got sick. Nolan started coming after she died, said he wanted to stay connected to something she'd cared about. Patricia paused. He never says that anymore, but I think it's still true. Avery sat with that for a moment. She thought about the report her researcher had compiled. The house, listed in Rachel Hayes' name before the marriage, inherited from her parents, now listed under Nolan's. The property that had been in that family for decades. The one real asset he had, and from what Patricia was now implying, the one thing he was apparently considering selling to keep this building running. She thought about the $50 bill sitting neatly in the wallet. She thought about a lot of things. She thanked Patricia and stood to leave. At the door she paused, and she wasn't entirely sure why she said the next thing, but she said it anyway. I'm going to look into what happened with the funding. I need some time to understand what I'm dealing with. Can you give me 2 weeks before you make any permanent decisions about the programs? Patricia looked at her for a long moment. I've been waiting 3 months, she said. 2 weeks isn't going to break me. Avery nodded and went back out through the narrow hallway into the main room. The dinner service was in progress. Long folding tables had been set up, and kids were moving through a line at the kitchen window, collecting plates. The room was louder now. The particular productive noise of people eating and talking and arguing about nothing in particular. Someone had changed the music on the old Bluetooth speaker in the corner to something with a fast beat, and a small girl was dancing to it while she waited in line, completely unself-conscious, arms going in different directions. Nolan was at one of the tables. He was sitting next to Marcus Jr., the kid who'd apparently been having math trouble, and they had a notebook open between them. Marcus Jr. was 11 or 12, with glasses and an expression of deep personal grievance, and he was explaining something to Nolan in a very emphatic voice. And Mrs. Terry said I was being disruptive, but I wasn't being disruptive. I was correcting her because she said 6 times 7 was 43, and it's 42, so... She said 43? She said 43. Nolan pulled the notebook toward him, wrote something on it, pushed it back. Okay, you were right. Marcus Jr. looked vindicated, and then immediately suspicious of the easy agreement. She got mad at me for saying it. Yeah, she probably did. How'd you say it? A pause. Kinda loud. In front of the class. Another pause. She was writing it on the board. Nolan was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone formulating a lecture. The silence of someone genuinely thinking. Here's the thing, he said finally. You being right doesn't automatically make the way you said it right. Both things can be true. Marcus Jr. looked at the notebook. He was clearly processing this with some reluctance. Does that make sense? Nolan said. Kind of. It'll make more sense when you're older. That's what adults say when they don't want to explain something. Nolan smiled at that. The same unprepared smile Avery had seen in the parking lot, the one that made him look younger than his age. Fair, he said. But in this case, I actually mean it. Avery watched this from near the door. She should have left. She'd gotten what she came for. The conversation with Patricia, the information she needed to start pulling the thread on what had happened with Meridian Partners and the redirected funds. She had enough to work with. She had 2 weeks before Patricia would start cutting programs. She stayed for another 10 minutes. She stood near the wall, not conspicuously, just present, watching the room the way she'd learned to watch rooms, not at the center of activity, but at the edges, where the real information lived. She watched the kids eat and argue and laugh, and occasionally, briefly, lean against each other with the unconscious ease of people who'd been sharing space long enough to trust it. She watched Patricia move through the room with the quiet authority of someone who'd built a thing and knew every corner of it. She watched Deshawn show Marcus Jr. something on a worksheet with the particular pride of someone who'd recently figured out the same problem. And she watched Nolan, who was now standing at the supply closet door again, looking inside with the compressed expression she'd come to recognize. He pulled out his phone, made a note in something, closed the closet door. He turned and caught her eye. Just briefly. A glance across the room, the kind that happened when you became aware of a presence you hadn't accounted for. His expression didn't change dramatically, just a slight recalibration, the way someone looked when they recognized a face from a context they hadn't expected. He walked across the room. "You're the CEO," he said. Not a question. "You recognized me. I looked you up after the call. Company website." He said it without apology. "What are you doing here?" "Talking to Patricia." She paused. "And watching." He absorbed this without visible reaction, which she'd come to understand was just how he processed things. He wasn't cold. He was just someone who didn't externalize everything immediately. Watching what? How this place runs, what it does. She held his gaze. What it costs to keep running. Something tightened in his jaw. Not defensively, just a recognition of what she was implying. Patricia doesn't need anyone coming in here to assess. I'm not assessing it. I'm trying to understand something that turns out to be connected to my company. She let that land for a second. I think some of the money that should have come here got redirected somewhere it shouldn't have. I'm trying to figure out how much and by whom. He was very still. That's a serious thing to say, he said, and his voice had changed. Not harder exactly, but more careful. The voice of someone who'd learned to be precise about serious things. I know. What are you going to do about it? She'd been asked harder questions in boardrooms by people with significantly more leverage over her than this man had, and she'd always had an answer ready because preparation was the foundation of authority. She didn't have a fully formed answer this time. She had a direction. She had a notebook with 2 pages of notes, and a growing suspicion about someone who reported to her and whose name she was not prepared to say out loud yet. I'm going to find out how far it goes, she said, and then I'm going to deal with it. He looked at her for a long moment. She noticed for the first time up close how tired he was. Not just the regular end of a long day tired, but the kind that lived deeper than one night's sleep could reach. The kind that was structural. She knew that kind of tired. She'd seen it in the mirror at intervals over the past 2 years, in the stretches when the company was struggling and she'd been the last one in and first one back. The difference was that her tiredness had an exit. There was a version of her future where the company stabilized and the work eased and she could sleep more than 5 hours without guilt. She wasn't sure his had that. Why are you telling me this, he said. Because you're going to figure out the center is in worse shape than you know. And when you do, I don't want you to do something you can't undo. She paused. Like sell something that belonged to your wife. He went completely still. It had been a risk to say it. She'd known that when she decided to. It was personal information obtained through means she couldn't exactly defend, and deploying it was a calculated decision that she wasn't fully comfortable with even as she made it. His expression went through several things quickly. Surprise. Something rawer than surprise, and then a very controlled settling. You had me investigated. I had information gathered. There's a difference. Is there? She held her ground. I needed to understand the situation. I didn't do it to be intrusive. But here we are. Here we are, she agreed. He looked past her, at the room full of kids and noise and the comfortable chaos of the dinner service. She could see him doing something internally, weighing, deciding, the particular arithmetic of someone calculating whether to trust a thing. The house is mine to decide about, he said finally, not yours. I know. And whatever you're doing with this funding investigation, that's your business, not mine. Also true. So what do you want from me? It was a direct question and she answered it directly. Nothing right now, I just wanted you to know someone was paying attention. He looked at her. That's not a threat, she said. I mean it the other way. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, something in his posture shifted, not opening up exactly, but releasing a fraction of the held quality it had had since he crossed the room, like a single muscle deciding to stop working. You want coffee? He said. Patricia keeps a pot in the office. It's terrible. Avery blinked. Sure. Fair warning, he said, turning toward the back hallway. It's been sitting since 2 o'clock. She followed him. The coffee was, in fact, terrible. She drank it anyway, standing in Patricia's small office while Nolan leaned against the doorframe with his own cup, and they talked for 40 minutes about things that were and weren't the point. The center's programs, the kids who came there, the particular bureaucratic frustration of grant applications that asked for outcomes that couldn't be quantified. He didn't ask her more about the investigation. She didn't offer more than she'd already said. But there was a moment, near the end, when she was putting on her coat, and he was looking at the property tax number she'd seen him write in his phone, when she said, "Don't do anything permanent yet." And he said, without looking up, "I'm not making any promises." And she knew she had maybe 10 days before whatever he was considering became a decision. She drove back to her office. She called her internal legal team at 9:30 at night. She told them to pull 6 months of disbursement records from Meridian Partners. She told them it was urgent. She told them to be quiet about it. The Meridian Partners records arrived at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, forwarded by her legal team with a subject line that said, "Preliminary review," flagged items attached, and a message body that was exactly one sentence. "You're going to want to read this carefully." Avery read it carefully. She sat at her desk with the city dark behind the windows and a fresh coffee going cold beside her keyboard, and she went through 41 pages of disbursement records with a yellow highlighter and the particular focus she reserved for things she was not yet ready to say out loud. By 1 in the morning, she had filled 6 pages of her notebook. By 2, she had a headache building behind her left eye that she recognized as the kind produced not by eye strain, but by sustained low-grade dread. The structure of it was almost elegant, in the way that fraud was sometimes elegant, built by someone with enough institutional knowledge to know exactly where the gaps were, where the oversight was thinnest, where a number could be moved without triggering an automatic review. The money hadn't vanished, it had migrated. Charitable giving allocations from Langford Tech Group's philanthropic fund, dispersed quarterly through Meridian Partners to a list of approved community organizations, had been systematically redirected over an 18-month period. Not all at once. Not in large, obvious chunks, in increments small enough to read as rounding adjustments, administrative fees, reallocation notices, the financial language of process rather than theft. But the total, when she added it across 6 quarters, was not small. She wrote the number at the top of a fresh notebook page and looked at it for a long time. Riverside Learning Center had lost 40% of its operating budget. Avery now understood that 2 other organizations, a youth sports program in the city's South End, and a food assistance network serving elderly residents, had experienced similar funding gaps over the same period. She hadn't connected those dots until tonight because nobody had put them in the same room yet. She connected them now. The common thread ran directly back to one person. His name was Carter Voss. He was 44 years old, had been with the company for 7 years, and currently held the title of Senior Vice President of Strategic Partnerships, a position that gave him oversight of, Among other things, the administration of the company's charitable giving program. He'd been one of Avery's first significant hires after the company's Series B, brought in for his deep network of institutional relationships and his reputation for executing deals that other people couldn't close. He was polished and persuasive and very good at being in a room, and Avery had trusted him with real authority because he'd earned it, or she'd believed he had. She thought about the last board meeting. Voss at the end of the table, jacket on, tie straight, laying out the Q3 partnership numbers with the confidence of someone who knew the landscape of the conversation better than anyone else in the room. The easy authority of him. The way he framed the charitable program as a PR asset, a relationship building tool, a soft infrastructure investment. She'd nodded along to all of it. She set down the highlighter. She picked up her phone. She did not call Voss. That was the most important decision of the next 12 hours. Not calling Voss, not alerting anyone in the senior team who was close to him, not doing anything that would signal the investigation before she knew its full shape. Fraud investigations collapsed when targets had warning. She knew this in theory, and she understood it now in a very concrete, immediate way. She called her external legal counsel instead. James Hargrove, a corporate attorney she'd worked with since the company's founding, a man who'd answered late-night calls before, and who picked up on the third ring with the resigned alertness of someone who'd been half expecting to hear from her. "Tell me what you have," he said. She told him. He was quiet for a long time after she finished. "How solid is the documentation?" "Solid enough that I can't explain it any other way. I've been trying for 2 hours." "Who else has seen this?" "My legal team sent it, but only 2 people saw the flagged summary. I haven't told them what I found." "Keep it that way for now." She heard him moving, the sound of a lamp clicking on. "I'll be at your office at 7. Don't touch anything in the system tonight. Don't access any of Voss's files directly. That needs to be done through a forensic process, or it becomes a chain of custody problem." "I know." "Avery." A pause. "This is going to be a difficult few weeks." "I know that too." She hung up and sat in the silence of her office. Down in the street, 40 floors below, a garbage truck moved slowly through the dark with its amber lights blinking. She watched it until it turned out of sight. She thought about Nolan's face when she'd said, "Don't do anything permanent yet." The way he'd looked back at his phone, at the property tax number he'd written down, and said, "I'm not making any promises." She didn't have weeks. She had days, maybe. She opened a new document on her computer and started typing. She met with Hargrove at 7 and her internal legal team at 8:30, having spent the intervening 30 minutes in the building's small gym running on a treadmill until she felt like a person again, rather than a collection of anxieties arranged in office clothing. The legal team, 2 lawyers, both careful and good at their jobs, were told the broad shape of what she'd found without being given the name yet. She needed the preliminary forensic review completed before that name entered the building's communication systems. The preliminary review took 3 days. Avery worked those 3 days with the split attention of someone managing 2 versions of reality simultaneously. In one version, she was the CEO of Langford Tech Group, attending meetings and reviewing budgets and making the 100 small decisions that kept an organization running. In the other, she was sitting with an expanding file of financial records that her legal team assembled piece by piece, each new document either confirming or complicating the picture. It confirmed the picture. On the 4th day, Hargrove called her at 6 in the morning. "We've got it," he said. "All of it." He was running a shadow account through a shell company registered under a variation of his wife's maiden name. Money went from Meridian into the charitable fund, then out to the approved organizations on paper, but the actual disbursements were fractional. The difference went into the shell account. He's been doing it for 6 quarters. How much total? Across all redirected organizations? Close to 900,000. She sat in her car in the building's parking garage. "He's been in my company for 7 years, she said. "I know. I gave him the partnership structure. I trusted him with the whole philanthropic arm." "Avery," Hargrove's voice was careful, "this is not a failure of your judgment. This is a very specific, deliberate deception by someone who knew exactly what they were doing." She knew he was right. She also knew that it would take longer than a phone call in a parking garage to feel that way. "When do we move?" she said. "Board notification today." Formal separation and law enforcement referral by end of week. I'd recommend a simultaneous communication to the affected organizations so they hear it from you directly before anything breaks publicly. I'll call Patricia Osei this afternoon. There's one more thing, Hargrove said. Some of this is going to be public. Press will get hold of it. How do you want to handle the story? She thought about that. Transparently, she said. We found it, we reported it, we're making it right. That's the story. That's a good story, Hargrove said. It's also true, which helps. She drove up from the garage and into the daylight. He said. She called Patricia at 2 in the afternoon from her private office with the door closed and her assistant holding all non-urgent communications. Patricia answered on the second ring. Ms. Osei, this is Avery Langford. I have something to tell you, and I wanted you to hear it directly. She told her. She was thorough and specific, and she did not soften the parts that were hard to say. The fraud, the scale of it, the person responsible, the process now in motion to recover the funds and refer the matter for legal action. Patricia was quiet for a long time after she finished. 900,000, she said finally. Not a question. Processing. Across 3 organizations. Your center's share was significant. I'm still calculating the exact figure, but it will be in the range of what you lost over the 18 months. And it's coming back? The shell account has been frozen. Recovery depends on the legal process, but yes, my intention is to make the affected organizations whole, regardless of what's ultimately recovered. If the legal process takes longer, the company will cover the gap. Another silence. Longer. Why are you telling me this before it's final? Patricia said. Avery paused. Because you've been waiting 3 months for an answer and you deserve one. And because there's someone who volunteers at your center who I'm concerned is about to make a decision he'll regret, and I want you to tell him that things are moving before he does. Patricia was quiet again. When she spoke, her voice had changed. Something in it gentler, more careful. You're talking about Nolan. He asked you about property taxes. He did. Tell him to wait, Avery said. Please. Ms. Langford, Patricia paused. Can I ask you something directly? Yes. How did you end up in that parking lot, watching this building for a week before you came inside? Avery looked out the window at the city. He returned my wallet, she said, with everything in it. Patricia made a sound, not quite a laugh. Something quieter than that. The sound of a person recognizing something they already suspected. That sounds like him, she said. Patricia told Nolan that evening. She didn't give him all the details. Those weren't hers to give. She told him the funding withdrawal was being investigated, that it was connected to fraud at the level of a major donor, and that the people responsible were being removed. She told him it was going to take time to fully resolve, but that there was reason to believe the center's financial situation would stabilize. Nolan sat across from her in the small office and listened with the stillness he always had when he was paying close attention. How solid is this? He said when she finished. From what I understand, very solid. Who told you? The CEO of the company whose money was redirected. She called me directly. Something moved in his expression. Langford. Patricia looked at him steadily. She told me you'd already met. He sat back in the folding chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. The particular look of someone fitting pieces together. She's been watching this place. Apparently. Since before she came inside. Since about the same night she got her wallet back, from what I can gather. Nolan was quiet. She seemed concerned, Patricia said carefully, about a decision you might be considering. He brought his eyes back down from the ceiling. He looked at her with the expression of a man who knew he'd been anticipated and wasn't sure how he felt about it. She told you about the house. She implied, it's my house, it's my choice. Nobody's disputing that. Rachel's parents built that place. It's been in the family for 30 years. His voice was even, but Patricia knew him well enough to hear the cost in it. If it kept this center running, I think Rachel would have been okay with that. I think she would have too, Patricia said gently. But maybe we don't have to find out. He looked at the desk, at his hands. He had the look of someone who'd been holding a decision at a distance, trying to stay objective about it, and was now having to feel it properly. "How long do we need to wait?" he said. She asked for 2 weeks. That was 6 days ago. He nodded slowly. He sat there for a while longer without talking. Patricia let him. She'd known Nolan Hayes for 3 years, and she understood that he processed things laterally. He needed to sit beside the new information and turn it over before he could decide where to put it. Pushing him only made him go quiet in the wrong way. "I need to ask you something," he said finally. "Ask." "Why is she doing this? The CEO? Because she got her wallet back?" Patricia was quiet for a moment. "I think it started that way. Then it became something else." She paused. "Sometimes you see something that changes the question you are asking." He looked at her. "She came here to find out who you were," Patricia said. "I think what she found was more complicated than she expected." Nolan didn't respond to that. He picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, and set it back down. "I'm not selling the house yet," he said finally. "Good." "Yet," he repeated. "Noted." He stood up, and she could see the effort of it. Not physical, just the effort of setting aside a thing he'd been carrying and trying to trust that it would still be there if he needed it later. "I should check the supply closet," he said. Deshawn said the whiteboard markers were running low. "Third shelf," Patricia said. "I picked some up yesterday." He looked at her with something that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite relief, just recognition. "Thank you," he said. "Go check on the kids," she said. He went. The board meeting was on a Thursday. Avery had called it as an emergency session, which she'd done exactly once before in the company's history, during the data breach 3 years ago, which had been resolved in 72 hours but had felt, at the time, like the beginning of the end of everything. This felt different, more controlled, more deliberate. She knew what she was walking in with, and she knew what she needed the board to authorize. And she had Hargrove beside her with 6 inches of documented evidence and a calm, methodical manner that had cost her a significant amount of money over the years and had been worth every dollar. Carter Voss was not at the meeting. He'd been told the previous evening, through HR and legal, that he was suspended pending an internal investigation and that he was not to access company systems or communicate with employees about any active matters. He'd called Avery directly 30 minutes after receiving the notice, which she'd expected. She'd let it go to voicemail. She'd let the 3 calls after that go to voicemail as well. She'd listened to the last message once. "Avery, this is a misunderstanding. I need 5 minutes to explain. Whatever you think you found, you don't have the full context. Call me back." She'd deleted it and gone to bed. The board meeting lasted 3 hours. Hargrove walked the 8 members through the documentation methodically, answering questions with the precision of someone who'd done this many times. The numbers were not in dispute. The structure was not in dispute. The chain of authorization, who had signed what, when, through which channels, was documented cleanly. There was a period of about 40 minutes when 2 of the board members, both older men who'd been with the company since the Series A, asked the questions Avery had anticipated. About due diligence failures, about oversight gaps, about what this meant for the company's public position. She answered all of them directly and without defensiveness, which cost her something. It always cost her something to sit in a room and be accountable for a failure she hadn't committed but had enabled through trust. She did it anyway. By the end of the 3rd hour, the board had authorized the formal referral to law enforcement, the engagement of a forensic accounting firm to complete the full audit, and the commitment of company funds to make affected organizations whole on a timeline independent of legal proceedings. She drove from the board meeting to the community center. She hadn't planned to. She'd planned to go back to the office and manage the next phase of communications. The press release was ready, Patricia had been briefed, the other 2 affected organizations had been called. There was a full afternoon of operational work waiting, but she found herself on Nolan Street instead, and then in the patchy parking lot, and then pushing through the side door of the building into the warmth and noise of the after-school program. She stood just inside the entrance. Nolan was at the whiteboard. He was in the middle of a math lesson with 4 kids who ranged from approximately 9 to 13, and the lesson was not going smoothly. She could tell by the expression on his face and the increasingly chaotic arrangement of numbers on the board. One of the kids, a girl with 2 braids, was arguing with the answer he'd written, not rudely, persistently. "That's not how Ms. Chen does it," the girl said. Ms. Chen's method works too, Nolan said. There's more than one way to get there. But yours is longer. Mine shows why it works. Ms. Chen's is faster. When you understand why it works, you use the fast version. The girl considered this with the expression of someone granting a partial concession. Okay, but I'm still doing it Ms. Chen's way on the test. That's completely fine, Nolan said. He looked up then, and his eyes found Avery near the door. He didn't say anything. He held up one finger, 1 minute, and turned back to the board to finish the problem. She waited. The kids dispersed to their tables with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Nolan capped the marker, set it on the tray, and walked to where she was standing. He looked at her face. It happened, he said. This morning. Board authorized everything. Voss is suspended. Law enforcement referral goes in tomorrow. Forensic audit starts Monday. He absorbed this. The money. The company is covering the gap for all 3 organizations directly, on a timeline separate from whatever gets recovered legally. Patricia's going to have confirmation in writing by tomorrow afternoon. He was quiet. She watched him process it. The slow, lateral way he processed things, turning it over, checking the sides of it. His face was tired. He'd probably been at the cafe until after 10 last night, but there was something in his eyes now that hadn't been there the first time she'd seen him. The first real time, up close, when he'd crossed the room and looked at her with the careful suspicion of someone who'd learned that powerful people usually wanted something. Just like that, he said. It wasn't just like that. It was 2 weeks of legal work and a 3-hour board meeting. I mean, he stopped. He looked down at the floor and then back up. The center is okay. The center is okay, she said. He nodded. Once. Slowly. She'd expected him to look relieved, the way people looked when a thing they'd been dreading turned out all right. He did look relieved. But underneath it, there was something heavier, something that had been held under tension for a long time and was now releasing in a way that wasn't entirely comfortable, the way a clenched muscle felt when it finally let go. Patricia said you were worried about the house, he said. I was. You didn't need to be. I know that now. He looked at her steadily. I need you to understand something. It was my decision to make. If it had come to that, I know, she said. I'm not arguing with you. I just didn't want it to come to that if it didn't have to. He was quiet for a moment. Why? He said. And it was the same question he'd asked her before. Why are you doing this? What do you want from me? But this time it had a different weight, not suspicious, more like genuine, almost reluctant curiosity. Avery looked at the room around them, at the kids at the tables, the hand-painted sign on the wall, the mismatched chairs, the whiteboard with Nolan's longer but correct math problems still visible above where he'd erased Ms. Chen's faster version. She thought about the parking lot and the notebook, and a laugh she hadn't been supposed to hear. Because someone showed me what it looked like when a person actually meant what they did, she said, and I hadn't seen that in a while, and I didn't want to watch it get taken apart by something that was fixable. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then Deshawn appeared from nowhere, as Deshawn had a talent for doing, and said, Mr. Nolan, Marcus Jr. says you told him the commutative property doesn't matter, and now he's not doing his worksheet. I definitely did not say that, Nolan said. That's what he said you said. Take me to Marcus Jr. He glanced at Avery. You staying? She thought about the press release draft on her computer and the calls she needed to return, and the operational machinery of the next several days bearing down on her calendar. For a little while, she said. He nodded and followed Deshawn across the room. Avery found an empty chair at one of the side tables and sat down. A girl she didn't know, 7 or 8, wearing a yellow sweater, slid a drawing across the table toward her without explanation. It was a house with a big tree, 2 stick figures in the yard. Avery looked at it. That's me and my mom, the girl said. I'm adding a dog, but I haven't drawn it yet. What kind of dog? The girl thought about this seriously. A big one. Good choice, Avery said. From across the room, she could hear Nolan explaining the commutative property to Marcus Jr. in a patient, unhurried voice, and Marcus Jr. pushing back with the particular energy of a kid who had opinions and wasn't shy about them. She sat there. She didn't check her phone for 20 minutes. That was, she would later reflect, the first time she'd done that in approximately 2 years. The press release went out on a Friday morning. Avery had written 3 drafts of it herself before handing it to communications, which was 2 more drafts than she usually wrote personally. Most public statements she reviewed and approved, she didn't originate. But this one she needed to get right in a way that she couldn't fully explain to her communications director, who was professional and capable and kept gently suggesting that the legal department should review the phrasing of the 3rd paragraph before it went anywhere. The 3rd paragraph named Carter Voss. Not by title, not obliquely, by name, with the specific conduct described in plain language, the redirection of charitable funds, the shell account structure, the 18-month timeline. Her legal team had argued for vaguer language. Hargrove had said it was her call, but noted that naming him created certain litigation exposures. Her communications director had said that naming him wasn't standard practice in these situations. Avery had kept his name in. She'd thought about it carefully. She'd thought about Patricia Osei spending 3 months making calls that went nowhere, submitting grant applications to cover a gap that had been manufactured by deliberate theft. She'd thought about the youth sports program in the South End, which had cut its Saturday sessions and hadn't been able to restore them yet. She'd thought about the Food Assistance Network, where a coordinator had told Avery's team during the outreach call that they'd had to turn away 43 households in the months the funding had been missing. 43 households. She'd kept his name in. The release hit at 9. By 9:30, her inbox had 214 emails in it. By 10, 3 reporters had called her direct line, which almost nobody had. She did 2 phone interviews that morning and a brief on-camera statement in the lobby that her communications team set up with 12 minutes notice, and she said the same things in all 3. The company found the problem. The company reported it. The company was making the affected organizations whole. She was direct, and she did not editorialize, and she did not perform indignation, because performed indignation was the sound of someone managing optics rather than managing a problem. At 11:15, between the second interview and the lobby statement, she got a text from a number she'd saved under Nolan. Sent her. It was 3 words, saw the statement. She typed back, "How is it?" A pause. Then, "You named him." She typed, "Yes." Another pause, longer, then, "Good." She put her phone away and walked to the lobby. The days after the release were the particular kind of busy that wasn't productive. The kind where the work was mostly reactive, answering the same questions in different formats to different audiences, managing the gap between what had happened and what people understood had happened. Avery had been through enough company crises to know that this phase had a duration and that the duration was non-negotiable, and that the best thing to do was move through it steadily rather than efficiently. She moved through it. Voss had retained a lawyer, which was expected. The lawyer had sent a letter questioning the characterization in the press release, which was also expected. Hargrove handled the response. Law enforcement had opened a formal investigation, which moved at the pace law enforcement investigations moved, which was to say, not quickly, but with a deliberateness that suggested they found the documentation as clear as Avery had. The forensic audit was ongoing. 3 days after the release, Avery was in a late meeting when her assistant knocked and came in with the expression she reserved for things that couldn't wait. She handed Avery a printout. It was a screenshot of a local news website. A reporter named Sandra Chu, who covered city business and had been one of the 3 who'd called Avery's line the morning the release went out, had published a follow-up piece. The headline was, "Who Inspired Langford's Fraud Investigation? A Cafe Worker and a Lost Wallet." Avery read the first 3 paragraphs. Someone had talked. She didn't know who, Patricia possibly, or someone at the cafe, or someone who'd seen her car in the center's parking lot during those first weeks. The story wasn't complete or entirely accurate, but it had the shape of the truth. CEO loses wallet, honest man returns it. CEO follows honest man, discovers he's quietly keeping a community center alive, discovers her own company's money was being stolen from that center. It was a good story. She could see why Sandra Chu had wanted to tell it. She also understood, reading it, that Nolan was now named in a news article connected to her company's fraud investigation, and that he hadn't agreed to that, and that he was going to have opinions about it. She texted him, "Have you seen the piece in the Tribune?" The response came back in under 2 minutes. Yes. She typed, I didn't give them your name. A longer pause. I know. Patricia told me she talked to the reporter. She didn't mean for it to come out like that. Avery sat back in her chair. Are you okay with it? The pause this time was long enough that she wondered if he wasn't going to respond. Then, I need to think about it. Can we talk later? She told the meeting she needed 20 minutes and stepped out. She drove to the center at 7. He was in the parking lot when she arrived, sitting on the hood of his Civic with a coffee cup she recognized as the kind from the gas station 2 blocks over. He'd come from the cafe. He was still in his work clothes, the green jacket over the apron he'd untied but not taken off yet, hanging loose around his waist. He looked at her when she pulled in. Not unwelcoming, just waiting. She got out and stood beside her car. The October air had turned properly cold now. The kind that meant it and didn't apologize. Their breath showed faintly. How bad is it? She said. It's fine. He said it without resentment, just assessing. It's a weird thing to have your name in an article, but it's not wrong. The facts are right. Patricia didn't mean, I know, she called me. He looked down at the coffee cup. She cried a little. I told her it was fine. Was that true? He considered the question seriously, which she'd learned he always did. Mostly, I don't love having attention on me. But if the story helps people understand why the center matters, he paused. I can live with that. She nodded. He looked at her sideways. The reporter wants to interview me. What did you tell her? That I'd think about it. He glanced at her. What do you think I should do? She was surprised he was asking. She thought about it honestly. I think if you give the interview, you do it on your own terms. You tell the parts you want to tell, and you leave out the parts you don't. She paused. But I also think you don't owe anyone the story. You returned a wallet. The rest of it happened because of decisions I made. You don't have to be the human interest hook on a corporate fraud piece. He was quiet for a moment. That's a more honest answer than I expected, he said. What were you expecting? I don't know. A recommendation in favor of the interview. Better press for you. She shook her head. The press is fine. It's going to be fine regardless. This is your call. He drank the last of his coffee. She asked me if I knew who you were when I found the wallet, he said. The reporter. She wanted to know if I would have done it differently if I'd known. What did you tell her? I told her I didn't open it to check. I just looked for a way to return it. Avery looked at him. In the ambient light from the center's windows and the street lamp at the edge of the lot, his face was tired and ordinary and entirely itself. She thought about the research report and the slim leather wallet and the $50 bill sitting exactly where it was supposed to be. Would you have, she said, done it differently if you'd known? He thought about it. No. What would be the point of that? She nodded slowly. Can I ask you something? He said. Yes. That first week, in the parking lot. He looked at her. What were you actually trying to figure out? She considered how to answer that honestly. Whether you were real, she said, whether what you were doing was what it looked like, or whether there was something else underneath it. And it was what it looked like. She paused. I found that difficult to process. He looked at her for a long moment, not pleased by this exactly, more like he understood something about it and was deciding whether to say so. People do good things, he said. Regular people. All the time. It's not that unusual. I know that. Do you? She opened her mouth and then closed it. It was a fair question. She ran a technology company with 200 employees. She spent her days making decisions about systems and incentives and organizational architecture, and somewhere in the years of doing that, she'd started to experience individual human behavior primarily as a variable in a larger equation, something to be accounted for and managed, not something to be surprised by. Maybe not as well as I should, she said. He nodded, not judgmentally, just acknowledging it. They stood in the parking lot in the cold for a little while without talking, and it wasn't uncomfortable, which was something she noticed because silences with people she didn't know well were usually uncomfortable, and this one wasn't. How's your daughter? She said. He looked at her, and there was a brief flicker of something in his face, a slight reassessment, like he'd recalibrated an assumption. She's good. She's 8. She's currently obsessed with a book series about a girl who can talk to horses. Is it good? I have no idea. She reads it to me at bedtime, and I'm usually asleep by page 3. He paused. I feel terrible about that, but I also have not found a solution. You're working 2 jobs. Still. He said it with the low-grade self-criticism of someone who set expectations for himself that weren't entirely reasonable. She thinks it's funny. She shows me pictures of where I fell asleep and sends them to Carol. Avery smiled at that. He didn't miss it. He looked at her briefly, as though verifying it was real, and then looked back at the building. I should go in, he said. I know. He slid off the hood of the car, paused. You should come meet her sometime, Lily. She'd probably want to know what a CEO looks like. It was an offhand thing to say. It wasn't an invitation with any particular weight to it. Or if it was, he wasn't signaling the weight. But she felt the specificity of it, the particular intimacy of being offered a glimpse of someone's actual life rather than the public-facing version of it. I'd like that, she said. He nodded and walked toward the building. She stood in the parking lot for a moment after the door closed behind him. She met Lily on a Saturday afternoon 2 weeks later. Nolan had texted to say that he was bringing Lily to the center for a fundraiser Patricia was running, a craft fair, the hand-lettered signs for which Deshawn had apparently taken personally and produced with significant artistic investment. Avery had said she'd be there. She'd expected a brief, polite interaction. A hello, a nice to meet you, a few minutes of child-level conversation before Lily wandered off to more interesting things. Lily Hayes was not a brief interaction kind of kid. She was small for 8 and had her father's watchful quality, the same tendency to stand slightly back from a new situation and take it in before committing. She had dark hair and 2 uneven braids, Nolan's work probably, since they had the slightly asymmetric quality of braids done by someone who was doing their best under time pressure. And she was wearing a jacket with a horse embroidered on the pocket. She looked at Avery with direct, unhurried attention. You're the one who lost the wallet, she said. I am, Avery said. My dad found it. He did. He returned it very honestly. Lily considered this. He makes me do that too, with everything. She paused. Once I found $1 in the parking lot at the grocery store, and he made me give it to the store. Avery glanced at Nolan. He looked slightly pained. There was a customer service desk. $1, Lily said, with the tone of someone who had not fully moved on from this. It wasn't yours, Nolan said. We didn't know whose it was. Still wasn't yours? Lily looked at Avery as if hoping for an ally. Avery said carefully, He's not wrong. Lily sighed deeply and went to look at Deshawn's signs. Avery stood beside Nolan watching her go. She's going to give me that look until she's 40, he said. She's great. She's exhausting. He said it with a kind of fondness that made the word mean the opposite of what it said. The fundraiser was loud and crowded and successful in the way that community events were successful, not in the polished way of corporate charity events with their silent auctions and catered appetizers, but in the messy, genuine way of people who knew each other showing up for something that mattered to them. Avery had written a personal check before she arrived that covered roughly 2 months of operating costs, which she'd given to Patricia quietly and asked her not to announce. Patricia had looked at it, looked at her, and said, I'm not going to argue with you, which was the closest thing to a thank you Avery was going to get and was honestly fine. She spent 3 hours at the fundraiser. She bought a hand-painted ceramic mug that Deshawn had made in the center's art session, which he told her cost $8, but when she handed him a 20 and said keep it, he looked at the bill and said, I don't have change. And she said, I know. And he thought about this and decided it was acceptable. She helped Patricia set up a second table when the first one got crowded. She sat with a 7-year-old girl in a yellow sweater, the same one from 3 weeks ago, she was fairly certain, and watched the girl add a very large dog to her drawing. At one point, from across the room, she caught Nolan watching her. Not with any particular readable expression, just watching, the way she'd watched him in the first weeks without knowing quite why. She raised an eyebrow. He looked away. She smiled. The formal board meeting to present the completed forensic audit results was on a Wednesday morning, 5 weeks after the press release. The final number was just over $940,000 redirected across an 18-month period. The shell account had been partially liquidated by the time it was frozen, but the law enforcement action had recovered approximately 60% of it. Langford Tech Group had committed to covering the remaining gap for all 3 affected organizations directly, which the board had ratified without significant pushback, in part because it was the right thing to do, and in part because the alternative optics were considerably worse. Carter Voss had been formally charged. Avery had not allowed herself to feel much about that until it was official. When the notification came through from Hargrove's office, she'd read it, set her phone down, and sat at her desk for a few minutes in the early quiet before her assistant arrived. She thought about 7 years. She thought about the Series B board meetings where Voss had been the most prepared person in the room. She thought about a lunch 3 years ago where he'd talked about his kids, both of them teenagers, both of them apparently doing well, and she'd thought, this is what it looks like when a company builds the right kind of culture. She'd been looking at the product, not the person. She added that to the growing internal list of things she intended to do differently. After the board meeting, she called Patricia. "It's done," she said. "Formally, the audit is closed, the legal referral is complete, the recovery funds are being transferred this week." Patricia was quiet for a moment. "And the expansion funds?" This was the other thing, the thing Avery had proposed at the previous board meeting and which had passed, though not without discussion. Langford Tech Group was establishing a direct, multi-year funding commitment to Riverside Learning Center, structured as an institutional grant rather than a charitable giving allocation, meaning it came directly from the company's operating budget and was not administered through any third party. It was renewable annually, with transparent reporting requirements and a direct line of communication between the center and the company's CFO. No more Meridian partners. No more Carter Voss between the money and the people it was supposed to reach. "Transferring with the recovery funds," Avery said. "Patricia, your center is going to be able to expand. Programs, capacity, staffing, whatever Patricia Osei decides is most needed." Another silence. When Patricia spoke, her voice was steady, but only just. "I want to add evening programs for kids whose parents work late. Then add evening programs. And I want to hire Nolan." Avery paused. "Not voluntarily," Patricia said. "Properly. Paid position. He should be running the academic and outreach side of things. He's been doing it for free for 3 years, and it's not..." Her voice caught very slightly. "It's not right that he's been doing it for free." "I agree," Avery said. "He'll push back." "I know. He'll say someone else deserves it more." "I know that too. Are you going to talk to him first, or should I?" Avery thought about this. "I'll talk to him," she said. "But don't let him see it coming. He'll have a defense ready." Patricia made a sound that was half laugh, half something more tired. "I've known him 3 years," she said. "He always has a defense ready." "Then we'll need to be faster," Avery said. She heard Patricia smile through the phone. After she hung up, she sat for a moment with the window and the city behind her and the quiet of a problem that had been solved. Not cleanly, not without cost, but genuinely. The kind of solved that held. She thought about what Nolan had said in the parking lot. People do good things, regular people, all the time. It's not that unusual. She turned it over. She thought about what she'd said back. Maybe not as well as I should. She'd been honest, but she'd also been incomplete, because the truth was more specific than that. The truth was that she'd spent 2 years building a company and managing a company and worrying about the company, and somewhere in that time, she'd started measuring people by their utility to the structure she was building, rather than by the thing underneath structure, which was just, who are you when no one's accounting for it? The $50 bill had been an accounting moment. A small one. The kind that happened 100 times a day to 100 different people, and most of those moments passed without consequence either way. Nolan had passed it differently, and it had changed something in her. Not in a sudden way, not in a way she could point to and say, there, that was the moment. More like a slow correction, like a compass that had been reading slightly off for a long time, finding its proper bearing. She was still working out what to do with that. She pulled on her coat, picked up her bag, and walked to the elevator. She had one more conversation to have before the day ended. Plum. She found him at the center, as she usually found him, at a table with a kid, working through something with the methodical patience of a person who had decided that a thing was worth doing correctly and had made his peace with how long that took. The kid this time was a boy she hadn't seen before. Maybe 10, quiet, with the careful posture of someone who was new somewhere and hadn't decided yet whether it was safe to relax. He had a reading worksheet in front of him and the expression of someone who found reading worksheets specifically designed to be humiliating. Nolan was reading alongside him, not instructing exactly, just there. She waited until the kid had finished the page and Nolan had said something to him in a low voice that made him sit up slightly straighter. Then she walked over. Nolan looked up. He read her face with the accuracy she'd come to expect from him. "Something happened," he said. "Several things," she said. "Can we talk?" The boy looked between them with interest. 5 minutes. Okay? Nolan said to the boy. "Read the next page and I'll be right back." The boy looked skeptical. "What if I don't understand it?" "Then you mark the parts you don't understand and we go through it together when I get back." "How do I mark it?" "You have a pencil." The boy looked at his pencil. He seemed to find this logic acceptable. Nolan walked with Avery to the far end of the room, near the window that looked out at the parking lot. She told him about the audit and the charges and the recovery funds. He listened in the still way he listened to important things, not interrupting. Then she told him about Patricia's proposal. She watched his face. She'd been prepared for the defense. Patricia had been right. It was already assembling in his expression before she'd finished speaking, the particular set of his jaw that meant he was organizing reasons why a thing wasn't appropriate or wasn't his to take or wasn't what he deserved. "Nolan," she said. He stopped. "Before you say it, I know. You're going to tell me there are other people more qualified or that it feels wrong to take money for something you've been doing out of," she searched for the right word, "out of whatever it is you do things out of. And I understand that. But this is a real program now, with real funding and real capacity to grow. And it needs someone who knows it, someone the kids know, someone who already understands what it needs because he's been paying for the whiteboard markers out of his own pocket for 3 years. He looked out the window. "It would change things," he said quietly. "Yes. I'd have to leave the cafe and the dispatch job." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "I'd be around for Lily more." He said it almost to himself, not to her. Like he was thinking through the geometry of the thing, the actual practical shape of the life it would make possible. She let him think. From across the room, the new boy called out, "Mister? Hey, what do I call you?" Nolan turned. "Nolan's fine." "Nolan," the boy held up the worksheet. "This sentence doesn't make sense." "Mark it," Nolan said. "I'll be there in a minute." He looked back at Avery. "I need to think about it," he said. "That's fair. I need..." He stopped. He looked at the room, the kids, the tables, the hand-painted signs, the whiteboard with its accumulated math problems. "I need to know this is real. Not because I don't trust you, but because you've been doing this on your own and the ground's moved before," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "It's real," she said. "I'll put it in writing. Multi-year commitment, independent of anything that could change at the company level. Patricia has the documentation. You can look at it tonight if you want." He nodded slowly. "Think about it," she said. "Take the time you need." She walked to the door. "Avery." She turned. He was standing in the middle of the room with his hands at his sides, the tired, careful, entirely unperformative version of himself that she'd first seen in a parking lot and had spent 3 weeks trying to understand. "Thank you," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "You haven't seen the paperwork." The corner of his mouth moved. She walked out into the cold. He took 4 days to think about it. Avery had expected 3, maybe. She'd given him the paperwork the morning after their conversation. A folder that her legal team had prepared, clean and thorough, with the funding commitment structured exactly as she'd described. Multi-year, indexed to inflation, with an annual review process that required transparency from both sides, and gave the center full programmatic autonomy. No corporate branding requirements, no naming rights, no language about strategic alignment or shared values, or any of the other soft machinery that institutional philanthropy used to make giving feel like an investment. Just money, going where it was supposed to go, with accountability built into the structure so that what had happened with Meridian Partners could never happen the same way twice. She'd handed him the folder outside the center on a Thursday evening and said, "Read it when you have time, no pressure on timeline." Then she'd gotten in her car and driven away before he could hand it back. He called on Sunday evening at 8:43. She was on her couch with a bowl of pasta she'd made badly and a financial report she'd been trying to read for an hour, and when her phone showed his name, she felt something shift slightly in her chest that she chose not to examine too carefully. "I read it," he said. "And?" A pause, not a long one. "It's solid. Hargrove's good at his job. There's a line on page 7 about programmatic decisions being made independently of donor preferences." "Yes." "That's real? Nobody's going to call Patricia in 3 months and say the after-school program should be rebranded to include the company logo? Nobody's going to do that." Another pause. She could hear him breathing, and in the background the faint sound of something. A television, maybe, or a kid's show. Something with music in it. "Lily's still up?" she said. "She always does this thing on Sunday nights where she gets a second wind around 8 and convinces herself she's not tired." He paused. "She's not wrong about it. She actually isn't tired. I have no idea how that works." Avery smiled at the pasta she wasn't eating. "Nolan," she said, "you don't have to decide tonight." "I already decided," he said. "I just needed to call and tell you." She waited. "I'll do it," he said. She let the words sit for a second. "Okay," she said. "I'm going to need time to give notice at the cafe and the dispatch job properly. I'm not leaving Marcus short-handed." "Of course. And I want to talk to Patricia about the structure before we finalize anything. She should be the one who defines what this position actually looks like. Not me, and not Langford Tech." "Agreed completely." "And—" He stopped. "What?" A beat of silence. "I'm going to be bad at some parts of it," he said. "The administrative stuff. I don't have a background in nonprofit management or organizational development or any of that." "Nobody's asking you to be an administrator," she said. "Patricia's been running this operation for 9 years. She needs someone who knows the kids and knows the programs and can build the academic side responsibly. That's what you know." "I know fractions and leaking pipes. You know more than that, and you're aware of it." He was quiet for a moment. She could almost feel him deciding whether to argue further or whether the argument was mostly habit at this point, the reflexive downward pressure that people applied to their own expectations when they'd been operating close to the edge for long enough. "Lily's going to think this is funny," he said. "Why?" "She asked me last week what I wanted to be when I grew up. I told her I was already grown up. She said that wasn't an answer." Avery laughed. It surprised her slightly, the ease of it, the way it came out without the social intermediary step she usually applied to reactions in professional contexts, the half-second between feeling something and deciding how to express it. She hadn't been laughing like that very often over the past few years. "Tell her the answer is this," Avery said. He was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "Maybe I will." They talked for another few minutes about nothing in particular. Logistics, timelines, the fact that Patricia had already been sending him information about an after-school literacy program she'd found in another city that she wanted to model something on. He'd received it at 11:30 on a Friday night and had read the whole thing, which she'd apparently known he would. When they said goodnight, Avery set her phone down and looked at her apartment. It was a good apartment. High ceilings, good light, the kind of space that communicated competence and taste without quite being warm. She'd lived in it for 3 years, and she'd always meant to get more furniture and had never gotten around to it, so there were still corners that were emptier than they should have been, and walls that were largely bare except for one print she'd bought on a trip she took the year the company crossed $10 million in revenue, partly as a reward to herself, and partly because she'd needed to remember, somewhere in all the pressure, that the world was bigger than the quarterly targets. She picked up the financial report. She set it back down. She ate the pasta, which had gone completely cold. She sat there in the quiet of her apartment and thought about the past 6 weeks. The wallet, and the parking lot, and the 2 pages of notebook writing, and the long road from those to here. She thought about Carter Voss, who was facing charges that would probably result in a conviction, because the documentation was clean and the scheme was well evidenced, and juries tended to respond predictably to stories about money being stolen from community centers that fed children. She thought about the 43 households the Food Assistance Network had turned away, and the Saturday programs that had been cut, and the 3 months Patricia Osei had spent making calls that went nowhere. She thought about all the versions of this story that didn't have this ending. The version where she pocketed the lost wallet report and had her assistant send a thank you card and never followed up. The version where she saw the name Langford Tech in the funding paperwork and handed it to legal and let them manage it quietly. The version where the fraud was handled internally, disclosed minimally, settled for the smallest possible public footprint. Those versions existed. She'd had people, good people, smart people, recommend elements of all of them over the past 6 weeks, not out of malice, out of pragmatism, out of the perfectly understandable institutional instinct to protect what you'd built. She understood that instinct. She'd acted on it before. But she'd stood in a parking lot in the cold and watched a tired man laugh at something his kid said over the phone, and something in her had realigned, not dramatically, not permanently, but enough. Enough to say, not this time, not this way. She didn't think she was a better person than she'd been 2 months ago. She was skeptical of that kind of arithmetic, but she thought she was a more honest one, at least about this particular thing, about what the company was for, about what she was for. That felt like enough to work with. She went to bed before 11, which hadn't happened on a Sunday in longer than she could precisely remember. Nolan gave 3 weeks' notice at the cafe. Marcus received this information with the expression of someone who had seen it coming and was choosing not to say so. He shook Nolan's hand, told him he was an idiot for working 2 jobs for 3 years when he should have found something better sooner, and then said the cafe would need to post the closing shift position and that Nolan should tell him if he knew anyone who needed work. "I might," Nolan said. "There's a kid at the center, 17, looking for part-time. He's reliable." "Send him by," Marcus said. At the dispatch depot, the manager said he was sorry to lose him and asked if Nolan had any interest in picking up occasional weekend shifts if the center's schedule allowed. Nolan said he'd think about it. He probably wouldn't take it, but he wanted to leave the door open because he'd learned the hard way that certainty about the future was a luxury he couldn't afford. He told Lily on a Tuesday evening, sitting at the kitchen table after dinner while Carol was in the living room pretending not to listen. "I got a new job," he said. Lily was working on a drawing. She didn't look up. "What kind?" "At the center, the one I go to in the evenings." She looked up then. "You're going to get paid now?" "Yes." "For real money?" "Yes, Lily, for real money." She processed this with the focused attention she gave to things that required recalibration. "So you won't be at the cafe anymore?" "No." "Will you be home more?" He thought carefully about how to answer this. "More evenings, yes. The center job has regular hours. No more late dispatch shifts." Lily looked at him for a long moment. She had her mother's eyes, dark and direct and slightly too perceptive for a child. Nolan had always found this quality both wonderful and exhausting, because it meant that when he was performing okayness rather than actually being okay, she knew. "Are you happy about it?" she said. He thought about it honestly. "I think so. I'm also a little scared." She nodded slowly, like this was the right kind of answer. "Okay," she said, and went back to her drawing. From the living room, Carol made no sound at all, which was the sound of someone who had very carefully restrained themselves. The reopening ceremony for the expanded Riverside Learning Center was held on a Saturday in March. Patricia had spent 3 months overseeing the renovation, the addition of 2 new program rooms, an updated kitchen, proper insulation for the classrooms that had been unacceptably cold in winter, and a permanent sign above the main entrance, not hand-painted this time, though Patricia had kept the original hand-lettered one framed on the wall inside, because she felt it was important to remember what the place had looked like when it was held together by stubbornness and spare change. Nolan had been in the building almost every day of those 3 months. He'd also been there in an official capacity for 6 of those weeks. His start date had aligned with the renovation's final phase, which Patricia had described as trial by chaos, and which Nolan had described more accurately as exactly like always but with construction noise. He'd developed the framework for 3 new academic programs with input from the kids already attending. He'd hired a part-time literacy specialist, a woman in her 50s named Donna, who'd been tutoring in public libraries for 20 years and who had told Nolan in their first meeting that she wasn't interested in the money as much as she was interested in doing something with actual resources for once in her career. He'd also, with significant reluctance and one aborted attempt, started learning the administrative software Patricia used for tracking program outcomes, which he found genuinely confusing and which Deshawn, now 12, recently promoted in his own mind to unofficial junior staff, had twice helped him navigate with the particular condescension of someone who'd grown up digital, explaining things to someone who hadn't. "You just click the thing," Deshawn had said. "I clicked the thing." "Not that thing, the other thing. They look identical. They're different colors." "Deshawn, they're both gray." The Saturday of the reopening was cold but clear, the kind of March day that felt like a negotiation between winter and something warmer. Not spring yet, not fully, but the air had a different quality to it, a faint suggestion of relenting. Patricia had organized the event with her characteristic combination of meticulous planning and complete refusal to make it feel formal. There were folding tables outside with food, real food, catered from 3 local restaurants that had donated the service, enough to feed several hundred people if it came to that. There were kids everywhere. There was music from a speaker that was slightly too loud and that nobody turned down because nobody wanted to be the person who turned it down. The neighborhood had come. That was the thing Nolan kept noticing as the morning went on. Not just the families whose kids attended programs, not just the regular volunteers and donors, the actual neighborhood. People who'd walked over from the blocks surrounding the building, some of whom had been around when the center first opened 9 years ago, and some of whom were new to the area and had seen the signs Patricia had put up. An older man who'd told Nolan he used to play basketball in the lot when he was young and had watched the building change hands 3 times before Patricia got it. A woman with a stroller who said she'd heard about the after-school programs and wanted to know if her daughter could start in the fall. By 11 in the morning, there were close to 300 people. Patricia stood at the entrance with the expression of someone who was doing enormous internal work to stay composed and was mostly succeeding. She'd given a short speech, a very short one, which was intentional because Patricia believed that speeches at events like this were for the benefit of speakers rather than attendees, and that 300 people standing outside in March had not come to listen to speeches. She talked about the 9 years, about the original room in the back where they'd started, 8 kids and 2 folding tables and a box of donated pencils, about what the place had cost to build and what it would cost to lose. She'd said one other thing near the end. "This center exists because of stubbornness," she said, "mine, and the people who refuse to let it fail. But it exists right now, today, in this form, because someone returned a wallet." She paused. "I know that sounds like the setup to a joke. It's not. Pay attention to small things. You don't always know what they're connected to." Then she'd thanked everyone for coming and told them there was food. Nolan had been standing near the side door when she said it. He'd looked at the ground briefly, with the expression of someone receiving recognition they found mildly uncomfortable but had stopped actively resisting. This was progress. 6 weeks ago, he would have left the room. He looked up and found Avery watching him from across the crowd. She was standing near the far tables with a paper plate and a cup of coffee, wearing a coat he hadn't seen before, charcoal gray, less corporate than her usual clothes, the kind of coat that suggested she'd dressed for standing outside rather than for being seen at an event. She'd come quietly. She hadn't brought anyone from her communications team or made any indication to anyone at Langford that she was attending. She was just there, the way she'd been in the parking lot in October, slightly at the edges, watching. He crossed the crowd toward her. She held out the coffee when he got close. "You look like you need this more than I do." "I've had 3 already." "Have a 4th. He took it. It was warm and actual coffee, not the gas station variety, which meant she'd brought it from somewhere or someone had set up a real coffee station inside that he didn't know about. "Patricia's keeping it together," he said. "Barely," Avery said, not unkindly. "Yeah." He looked at the crowd. "She won't cry until everyone leaves. She never cries in front of people." "How do you know that?" "I've worked with her for 6 weeks and known her for 3 years. I've seen her cry exactly once, and it was because a kid she'd been worried about for months finally showed real improvement on a reading assessment, and she thought she was alone in the office." Avery looked at him. "You weren't going to tell her you'd seen." "Of course not," she smiled. They stood side by side and watched the crowd for a moment. Lily was somewhere in it. He'd brought her this morning, her first time at the center, and she'd immediately attached herself to Deshawn, who was not entirely sure how he felt about a small person following him with great interest, but was handling it with more grace than Nolan had expected. "Deshawn's been showing Lily around," he said. Avery looked in the direction he was looking. "How's that going?" She told him his signs were very good. He told her she had good taste. Now she's helping him hand out programs. She's 8. She's extremely capable of handing out programs. Avery found them in the crowd. Deshawn with a stack of paper programs, Lily beside him mimicking his manner with a smaller stack, both of them with the focused energy of people who had been given a job and intended to do it properly. She laughed. Again, that easy, unguarded laugh that she'd been noticing happening more often. She'd started paying attention to it as a metric of something. Not happiness exactly, but something adjacent to it. The quality of presence in a given moment, whether she was actually in the day she was in or managing it from a slight remove. She was in this one. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You always ask that first," he said. "You don't have to." She looked at him. "I know. I do it anyway." She paused. "How are you actually doing? With the job? With all of it?" He took a drink of the coffee she'd given him. "It's different," he said. "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, like something in me doesn't believe yet that the math works out, that I can be here and not somewhere else at the same time. The math does work out. Logically, I know that." He paused. "Last Tuesday, I picked Lily up from school, and we went to the library for 2 hours, and I sat next to her while she read, and I didn't fall asleep." He said it like it was a small thing, and it was a small thing, and it was also not a small thing at all. She thought it was weird that I stayed awake. Avery looked at him. "She asked if I was okay," he said. I told her yes. She said, "You look different." I asked how. She said, "Less tired." Then she went back to her book. He was looking at the crowd while he said it, not at Avery, and his voice was level in the way people kept their voices level when they were talking about things that mattered a lot and didn't want to make a larger production of them than felt earned. She understood that. She had the same tendency. "That's a good Tuesday," she said. "Yeah," he said. "It was." They were quiet for a moment. From somewhere in the crowd, she could hear Patricia's voice, the broad, carrying quality of it, directing someone about a table placement with the authority of a general who happened to also know where they kept the spare extension cords. Nearby, a group of kids she didn't recognize were climbing on the low retaining wall at the edge of the lot with the focused energy of children who'd been told not to and were doing it anyway while the relevant adults were distracted. One of them fell off. Not badly. He rolled, got up, checked his elbow with the practical self-assessment of a kid who'd fallen off things before, and developed a reliable system for evaluating whether anything was actually wrong. He determined it wasn't. Looked around to see if anyone had noticed, saw Nolan watching, and got a look on his face that was exactly the look of someone deciding in real time whether to be embarrassed. Nolan pointed at the wall with a specific expression. The kid sighed and got down. "How do they know?" Avery said. "Know what?" "When you're looking. They always know when you're looking." He shrugged. "You just have to look consistently enough that they can't count on you not being." She thought about that. It was such a simple thing to say. Such an obvious thing, in the way that true things often were. And yet she'd spent years managing an organization of 200 people, and she could count on one hand the number of times she'd applied that principle to the full depth of its meaning. Not just watching the metrics, not just reviewing the outputs, but actually being present enough in the texture of the daily thing that people couldn't assume she wasn't paying attention. She'd trusted Carter Voss for 7 years. She'd watched his performance, she'd reviewed his numbers. She'd been, in every formal sense, a diligent manager. She just hadn't looked consistently enough. "I owe you an apology," she said. Nolan looked at her. "Not for anything specific," she said. "For the framework. The way I came in here. Like you were a thing to be understood rather than a person to be introduced to." He was quiet for a moment. "You were trying to figure something out," he said. "You weren't wrong to do it the way you did. I was in your parking lot for 8 days before I came inside." "I know. That's strange behavior." A little. The corner of his mouth moved. "But the intent wasn't bad, and you were careful with it. I had your financial records, Nolan, your property information, your employment history." "I know," he said. "Patricia told me." He paused. "I was angry about it for about a day. Then I thought about it from where you were standing. Some stranger did an inexplicably honest thing, and you couldn't figure out why. And that bothered you because you'd stopped believing that kind of thing happened for no reason." He looked at her steadily. "I understand that. The world does a number on you when you're paying close attention." She held his gaze. "You're more generous about it than you need to be," she said. "I'm not being generous. I'm being accurate." He looked back at the crowd. "You fixed the thing you could fix. You fixed it directly and fast, and you put your name on it when you didn't have to. That counts for more than how you got to the question." She thought about the press release. Carter Voss's name in the 3rd paragraph. The calls she'd made to Patricia and the other 2 organizations before anything was public. The hours she'd sat in her car in a parking lot trying to understand something that turned out to be both more and less complicated than she'd expected. "You're easier to talk to than I thought you'd be," she said. "You thought I'd be guarded. You are, in person. But when you talk, you say what you mean." "I don't have the energy for the other thing," he said simply. She understood that completely. Across the crowd, Lily appeared, pushing through to where they were standing with the focused determination of an 8-year-old who had located a target and intended to reach it. She arrived between them, slightly out of breath. "Deshawn says we're out of programs," she told Nolan. "Tell Patricia." Patricia's talking to the man with the camera. "Then tell Donna." Lily looked at Avery. She'd met her twice now, at the fundraiser and once when Avery had stopped by the center briefly during the renovation, and had apparently made some internal determination about her that she hadn't fully communicated to anyone. "Are you staying for the whole thing?" Lily asked. "If that's okay," Avery said. Lily considered this. "There's going to be cake later," she said. "Patricia made it. It's probably good." "I like cake." Lily looked at her father. "She can stay for cake," she announced, and went back to find Donna. Nolan watched her go. He had the expression he sometimes got when Lily did something that was simultaneously very much like Rachel and very much like herself. A look that held a specific kind of weight, not sad exactly, just full. The way a moment felt when it was carrying more than the surface of it. He didn't say anything about it. Neither did she. Patricia's cake was, in fact, good. Chocolate with an uneven layer of frosting that suggested it had been decorated by a committee, which Patricia later confirmed it had, pointing out that 3 kids had been involved and that she considered the asymmetry a feature. The crowd thinned over the early afternoon. Families with young children left first, then the older couples who'd come out of neighborhood loyalty and stayed longer than they'd planned. By 2 o'clock, the folding tables outside had been cleared and folded, and the center's main room held a smaller, settled group, the core people, the ones who'd been there from early years or who'd built something here, staying in the particular comfortable way of people who didn't need an occasion to be somewhere together. Avery stayed. She sat with Patricia in the small office for a while, going through the program plans for the spring quarter. This had become a regular thing over the past month, not because Avery had inserted herself into the center's operations, but because Patricia had started calling her directly with operational questions, which Avery had come to understand was Patricia's way of saying, "You're part of this now, whether or not you have a formal role." She didn't mind. She'd started carving the time. "The literacy program numbers are good," Patricia said. "Donna wants to add a second session on Wednesdays." Does the budget support it? With the current funding, yes, through the fall at minimum. Then add it. Patricia made a note. She had the particular efficiency of someone who didn't waste time on decisions that had already been made, which Avery found deeply restful. Nolan wants to bring in someone to do basic computer skills for the older kids, she said. 12 to 16. He's been talking to a guy he knows from the logistics world who does IT and might volunteer. Support it. He's also been doing something on weekends, Patricia said carefully. Not connected to the center officially. Gathering the fathers, the ones who have kids here, for informal Saturday morning things, breakfast sometimes. Just talking. Avery paused. He mentioned that? He mentioned it to me last week. He doesn't call it anything. It doesn't have a name. He just... Patricia set her pen down. There are a lot of men in this neighborhood raising kids alone or raising kids in hard circumstances, and Nolan knows something about that. And he does this thing where he doesn't make it formal because the second it becomes formal, it becomes a thing people opt into or out of based on whether they want to be seen needing it. Avery thought about that. He makes it just... Patricia paused, searching. Just a thing that happens, so that people can be there without having decided to be there. That's smart, Avery said. It's Nolan, Patricia said, as though that were a sufficient explanation. It was, Avery thought. It largely was. She found him later in the main room, stacking chairs with a methodical efficiency that she'd noticed he applied to all physical tasks. Not fast, not showy, just steady and correct. Deshawn was allegedly helping, which in practice meant Deshawn was carrying one chair for every 3 Nolan carried and maintaining a running commentary on the day's events. The cake was uneven, Deshawn said. The cake was excellent, Nolan said. I'm not saying it wasn't good. I'm saying the frosting was uneven. Those are 2 different conversations. Help me with this table. They got the table. Lily was sitting on the low stage at the end of the room with 2 other kids her age, all of them with the settled tiredness of people who'd been social for several hours and had reached the comfortable end of it. One of the kids was showing Lily something on a tablet. Lily was watching with the focused, slightly skeptical attention she gave to new things. Avery stood near the door and watched the room. She'd been in a lot of rooms. Boardrooms and conference rooms and event spaces and restaurants where important meetings happened over food. Nobody ate properly. She'd been in rooms that were impressive, and rooms that were powerful, and rooms that were designed to make you feel both at once. She'd been in rooms that cost more per square foot than most people earned in a month. This room cost almost nothing. The floors were old wood, refinished, but not perfectly. You could still see the grain of past lives in it, the places where decades of chairs and shoes had worn paths between the tables. The ceiling was high and had been recently replastered, but there was one corner where it had been done in a slightly different shade, lighter, where a leak had been repaired. The chairs that hadn't been stacked yet were mismatched. 4 colors, 3 different styles, acquired over years from donations and secondhand lots in places that were clearing out. It was the kind of room that had been used for a long time for things that mattered. She felt something in standing there that she hadn't expected. Not sentimentality. She was suspicious of sentimentality, the way it could flatten complicated things into smooth, usable emotions. Something more specific than that. Something like recognition, like her own version of the realignment she'd been trying to describe to herself for weeks. She thought about the question she'd written in her notebook the first night in the parking lot. Who is Nolan Hayes? She had an answer now. It wasn't a simple one. He was a man who worked too hard and slept too little and made his daughter laugh and fixed what was broken and didn't keep the $50. He was someone who had absorbed an enormous amount of loss and continued anyway, not because he was exceptional. He would object to that word, and he would be partly right, but because he'd made certain decisions about what kind of person he intended to be, and those decisions didn't require exceptional circumstances to stick. They just required repetition, consistency. Showing up in the same way to the same places for long enough that people stopped wondering if you'd show up. He was, when she thought about it honestly, the most concrete version of integrity she'd observed in someone her own age. She wasn't sure what to do with that except be honest about it and try to act accordingly, which was, she supposed, all anyone could really do. She was still standing near the door when he finished the chairs and walked over. He looked tired in the good way. The way people looked at the end of a day that had used them properly. He had a smear of frosting on his jacket sleeve that she was fairly certain he hadn't noticed. "You're staying for the cleanup," he said. It wasn't a question. "I thought I might." "You don't have to." "I know." He looked at her for a moment, the particular look, direct, unhurried, reading the thing behind the thing. "You've been in that corner for 20 minutes, he said. "I was thinking." "About what?" She considered how much to say. "About the parking lot," she said. "About what I was trying to figure out back then." "Did you figure it out?" "I think I figured out I was asking the wrong question," she said. "I was trying to understand why you were the way you were. Like it was a puzzle, like there was a mechanism underneath it that explained it." She paused. "But there isn't, really. You just decided, and then you kept deciding." He was quiet for a moment. "Everybody decides," he said, "hundreds of times a day. Most of the decisions are so small they don't feel like decisions." "I know. But you made yours, the small ones, the ones that nobody sees, like they were the same as the big ones. Like it all counted the same." He looked down at the floor, then back up. "Rachel used to say that," he said. "Not in those words, but something like it." His voice was even. "She said you couldn't live one way in public and another way in private and expect the gap not to catch up with you." Avery held that. She thought about Carter Voss at the board table, jacket straight, tie straight. The numbers laid out with complete authority. She thought about all the ways a gap could grow between what you showed and what you were, and how long it could stay hidden if you were careful, and what it eventually cost. "She was right," Avery said. "Yeah," he said, "she was." They stood in the room while the light through the windows shifted into the particular pale gold of late March afternoon, and Lily called from the stage that the tablet kid wanted to know if there was more cake, and Deshawn said from somewhere behind the stack of chairs that he had in fact already checked, and there was not. And Patricia's voice came from the kitchen saying she'd heard that, and there was one piece left, and it was hers. Nolan shook his head slowly, with the specific fondness of someone who had spent years being responsible for people, and had started, against his initial expectations, to find it less like weight and more like structure, like the thing that told you where you were. "I need to get Lily home," he said. "She has school tomorrow." "I know." He looked at her. There was a question in it, not a complicated one, just the ordinary question of what came next, what the shape of things looked like going forward. She'd noticed it developing over the past few weeks, slow and careful. The way things develop between two people who were both inclined to be deliberate and neither of whom was inclined to rush what deserved not to be rushed. She wasn't going to rush it, but she also wasn't going to pretend she didn't see it. "Lily mentioned a horse book," she said. "She said she's almost done with the series. She's devastated about it. There's usually a sequel series." He raised an eyebrow. "You looked this up." "I looked this up." Something in his face settled. "She'd probably want to tell you about it," he said, "if you were around sometime." "I could be around sometime," she said. He nodded once, the same way he'd nodded when she told him the center was okay. That slow, deliberate nod of someone who was allowing themselves to believe a thing without yet being entirely sure of the ground. She understood that. She was standing on the same uncertain ground herself. But it was ground. And it was real. And that was more than she'd been standing on when she'd walked into a cafe on Harwick Street 2 months ago and left her wallet under a table. She helped stack the last chairs. She said goodbye to Patricia, who looked at her for a moment and then pulled her into a brief, efficient hug that was over before Avery could fully react to it. The hug of a woman who was not sentimental but recognized when something deserved acknowledgement and acted on it directly. She said goodbye to Deshawn, who told her the mug she'd bought at the fundraiser was his best work to date and that she should take care of it. She crouched down to say goodbye to Lily, who looked at her with those direct dark eyes and said, "Are you coming back?" "Yes," Avery said. Lily nodded once, the same nod as her father, the same deliberate quality, and went back to her conversation. Avery walked to her car. The parking lot was mostly empty now. The late afternoon had gone gray and cool, and the hand-painted sign above the door had its lights on. Someone had added small lights to it during the renovation, so it glowed now in the early dark, the letters warm against the fading sky. She sat in her car for a moment before starting it. She thought about what Patricia had said at the speech. Pay attention to small things. You don't always know what they're connected to. She thought about a wallet wedged under the lip of a cafe table, about $50 sitting exactly where it was supposed to be, about a man in a green canvas jacket standing in an alley breathing cold air and looking at a drawing on his phone, and the question she'd written in a notebook that night, and how long and strange the road had been from that question to here. She thought about the fact that she'd almost not followed him. She'd been standing on that sidewalk with a board call she was already late for and a full afternoon of overdue work bearing down on her, and she'd almost just gotten in her car and driven back to the office and filed the evening away as a mildly interesting data point about human behavior. She'd followed him instead. Not because she'd known what she'd find, not because she'd had any clear idea of what following him would mean, just because something in her had said, "Look closer." And she'd been paying enough attention to herself in that specific moment to listen. That was the thing nobody told you about integrity. Not the public version, not the version on the press release or in the speech or in the headline. The version that actually mattered happened in the gap between the easy choice and the right one, in the moment before anyone was watching, when the outcome was completely uncertain and the cost was real, and you did the thing anyway because that's who you'd decided to be. A $50 bill. A 10-second decision. 300 people standing in the cold eating cake in March. She started the car. She drove home through the city, through streets she was starting to see differently. Not the city of her company's address and her apartment's coordinates and the routes between them, but the city as a place where people were making those small, uncredited decisions every day, in parking lots and supply closets and kitchen tables and library chairs. The city as something built, always, out of what people chose when they didn't have to choose anything in particular. She thought she'd been missing that for a while. She didn't intend to miss it again.